In 2019, the UN made a statement in which they argued that we risk a climate apartheid scenario where the wealthy pay to escape overheating, hunger, and conflict, while the rest of the world is left to suffer. Essentially, as argued by Rice 2021, climate apartheid is a system of disadvantage in various ways based on different axes of oppression and privilege produced by the material effects of climate change. Figure 3 shows a particularly disastrous, although somewhat comedic depiction of this privilege with the drowning of various world leaders. Given the recent coining of the term climate apartheid, its specifics are still nebulous, with different academics presenting their own unique focus, such as Dawson 2017's specific reference to migrants and refugees, and Bond 2016's focus specifically on the African continent. Contextualizing the term into wider reading, the notion of a climate apartheid ties into post-colonial and neoliberal readings of climate change, such as Chakrabarty's 2012 Post-Colonial Studies and the Challenge of Climate Change, and Baldwin's 2017 Climate Change, Migration and Humanism.
Climate apartheid exacerbates already existing geographies of inequalities. These inequalities by the fact that the UN predicts that climate apartheid will force 120 million more people into poverty in the next 10 years. Furthermore, Rice et al. 2022 argue climate apartheid is evidence across vulnerability, access to resources, built environment, and mobility. Within this, vulnerability to climate-related hazards and unequal access to resources and ecologies necessary for a happy and healthy life. Adding to this, climate-related interventions in the built environment benefit some more than others. And finally, regarding mobility, climate change affects conceptualizations of citizenship in relation to migration and securitization, wherein citizenship becomes increasingly exclusive to some. Significantly, these factors are not only naturally uneven, but are unevenly produced historically and socially. Specifically, this poster focuses on the topic of vulnerability. The UN Office for Disaster Risk Reduction identifies vulnerability as the conditions determined by physical, social, economic, environmental factors or processes, which increases susceptibility of an individual, a community, assets, or systems to the impacts of hazards. Within the vulnerability, evidence shows that climate apartheid represents a complex system of precarity and privilege, wherein many live in environmental, social, and economic precarity under climate change, whilst others in a position of privilege are able to insulate themselves from climate-related risks and hazards.
By highlighting the socio-economic processes that shape current power relations and resource governance in Bangladesh today, the concept of climate apartheid can be illuminated. Colonialism and racial capitalism still underpin the nation of Bangladesh and are key concepts contributing to the climate apartheid. British colonial rule ended in Bangladesh in 1947, but has left deep-rooted inequalities that not only exacerbate the impacts of climate change, but also challenge the implementation of adaptation and mitigation schemes against climate change. Firstly, when examining the concept of colonialism, we can highlight how inequalities were shaped by the British via poor infrastructure development in delta regions. Prehistoric land tenure agreements constituted via historical power relations have caused key issues of overpopulation and slum dispersal onto floodbanks and sandbars known as chars, which are highlighted through figure 1 on the poster. Statistics highlight that currently there are over 14 million people living on these floodbanks and chars. These people's vulnerability is heightened by climate change impacts such as sea level rise and the salination of water. The second concept of racial capitalism contributing to the climate apartheid is also evident through the case study of Bangladesh. Agricultural sectors and resource extraction have created a wealth divide with the construction of devalued identities due to the production of racial narratives under capitalist and neoliberal regimes stemming from colonial rule. Almost half of the 169 million people living in Bangladesh are engaged in the agricultural sector due to racial capitalism. Agriculture is a key sector facing the direct impacts of climate change via issues such as drought and flooding impacting harvests. These deep-rooted historical manifestations of power relations further heighten vulnerabilities to climate change in Bangladesh and emphasize how climate change exacerbates privileged and racialized inequalities.
Thinking spatially contributes to an understanding of vulnerability as a factor of climate apartheid. Bangladesh is geographically vulnerable to the impacts of climate change, especially concerning fluvial systems, with 79% of the nation's landmass classified as flood and delta plains, Maplecroft 2017. Vulnerability to climatic variations and unusual weather events can easily be seen in Figure 2. The map The map of Bangladesh featuring 3 main rivers and their catchment areas combining, proving the riverine nature of the nation. Due to geographical location, Bangladesh has a tropical monsoon climate, leading to a flooding season. Paradoxically, this flooding has produced a fertile land which produces high-value crops, while increasingly negatively impacting the population. With 80% of Bangladesh's fertile alluvial lowlands zoned for agriculture, poor rural communities inhabit them. Such fertile farmland in other nations is not so susceptible to flooding, proving that geographic location has an impact on vulnerability. However, social production of vulnerability is continued and enhanced through developing apartheid, where the urban elite who rely on rural agriculture, both for their sustenance and economic benefit, create climate resilient spaces. The impact of this in Bangladesh is only going to be so large due to the combination of fertile land, geographic location, and the legacy of industry from the rule of the British Raj, leaving agriculture as a prominent industry. Agriculture is one of the sectors that is most susceptible to climate change, so countries with a large proportion of their economy in agriculture face a larger exposure to climate change. Bangladesh gains 14% of its GDP from agriculture, compared to 0.5% in the UK. A large exposure to climate change in Bangladesh will leave 80 million people threatened, with access to safe water, uninhabitable and uncultivatable land. This will force many to become environmental refugees. Thus, the geographical nature of Bangladesh complements historical power relations as a chief factor in creating uneven vulnerability within climate apartheid, as the landscape of the nation is particularly vulnerable to flash shocks, making adaptation and resilience schemes expensive and out of the reach for the majority of the rural population, those who are most vulnerable to the worsening impacts of climate change.
Before we accept these conclusions on the current evidence of climate apartheid, we also have to consider the validity of the term apartheid itself, particularly in the context of vulnerability in Bangladesh. This poster is aimed to deconstruct climate apartheid as a term that has been relied upon in media and popular culture accounts of the crisis. Apartheid is an Afrikaans term introduced in South Africa in 1929 to describe the country's harsh institutionalized system of racial segregation. Based on this historic understanding, one can assume that apartheid implies explicit aggression, a target group, and segregation. Therefore, academics have been questioning whether it is necessary to describe climate-related disparity as an apartheid. Alok Bhargava argues that it seems somewhat simplistic to compare climate change with the horribly unjust remnant of European colonialism. Instead, climate change is imposing a plague-like burden through its toxic effects on the global environment. Bhargava highlights the extreme reach of the impacts of climate change and the fact that it is not just a phenomenon that impacts a specific race in a certain country like the South African apartheid. Climate change and its impacts do not discriminate, and there is no explicit aggression towards a certain group. For example, it is not just less developed countries that are being impacted. Despite being the country with the third highest GDP in the world, Japan was ranked the country most affected by climate change on the Climate Risk Index. Hence, it can be argued the use of the term apartheid is ignorant to the bigger picture. When it comes down to it, this is a global environmental problem that requires a global effort to mitigate and adapt to it. However, when looking deeper into the use of the term climate apartheid, it can be understood to imply the inequality that exists between different countries, regions, and individuals in their ability to bypass the consequences of climate change through their ability to invest money into adaptation and mitigation. However, climate change is not explicitly an attack on those that cannot afford the mitigation responses. This again brings into question the use of apartheid to describe the global phenomenon. Overall, the use of the term relies on how literally you take its meaning and what scale it is applied. The ambiguity and controversies surrounding climate apartheid are owing to the fact that it is such a new term, meaning there are many different focuses and understandings. This ambiguity means that it's possible to refine your understanding of the case study or to the case study or situation that's being studied, which in our case is Bangladesh. By taking the concept to a global scale, it is evident that there is a disparity between the countries that are most influential in causing the crisis and those that are forced to deal with the consequences, which is what is demonstrated in Bangladesh. Therefore, by using Desmond Tutu's argument that the poorest countries are being left to suffer the consequences of crisis that was caused by the exploitation of natural resources by the richest countries, one can argue that climate apartheid is evident in the case of Bangladesh, because between 2000 and 2019, the country experienced 185 climate change-related extreme weather events and suffered $3.72 billion worth of damage, despite only contributing 0.56% of global emissions. And as previously recognized in the presentation, the hangover of the colonial period has meant that the country does not have the capacity to mitigate against these effects. Henceforth, through the example of Bangladesh, it can be argued that there is a global climate apartheid.